Good evening, one and all. Welcome you all in International Lecture Series 24. Today we are presenting a topic on culture matters, archaeology, environment, and forensic interpretations. Today we have our instructor, Sophia Perdikaris. She is a director of School of Global Integrative Studies. We welcome you, Sophia, and thank you for accepting our invitation so that more and more audience can learn and they came to know about that what actually archaeology help in a forensic and how this is important. I welcome you in our international lecture series in Sherlock Institute of Forensic Science along with my co-host Dr. Pooja Chakravarthy. As I told Dr. Sophia, she is a director of School of Global Integrative Studies. And I request my co-host, Dr. Pooja Chakravarthy, to give a brief introduction about our esteemed instructor of today. Dr. Pooja, over to you.
Sure, sir. Firstly, I thank you, ma'am, on behalf of Sherlock Institute of Forensic Sciences to be here with us today. And I'm especially thankful for choosing this topic because intermingling of these three subjects together is something very new to us, and I'm sure all our participants are going to benefit a lot from this. To introduce our topic for the day, she is an environmental archaeologist with a specialty in animal bones from archaeological sites, that is zoo archaeology. She is interested in people, environment interactions through time, and the response of both to big climatic events. She has worked in northern Norway and Iceland, concentrating on the transition from the Viking Age to medieval times and how the early commercialization of the cod fisheries, that is 1200 AD, affected the people and economy of the area. The last 15 years, she has been focusing on the island of Barbuda in the Caribbean, where she explored how heritage work can inform sustainability questions for the future. She has extensive experience in excavation and recovery of human remains from the sites in New York, New Jersey, Barbuda, and Kenya.
Thank you, Dr. Pooja, for introduction about our esteemed instructor. I welcome once again Dr. Sophia in our international lecture series and request you, madam, to take over the session and enlighten with your knowledge about this subject so that more and more audience can be benefited by your experience, your casework, and your uh, exposure about the subject. Madam, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the kind invitation. And I'm very excited about today's session. I will try to cover the subject and then allow time for question and answers. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, visible, madam.
Wonderful. So what I wanted to do is I want to start a little bit about what does it mean being the director of the Global Integrative Studies School. And that basically I'm in charge of all the fields of anthropology, of global studies, and of geography. And what I wanted to start this session with is actually talking a little bit about anthropology. And because we have, as you mentioned in your kind introduction, we have a different approach to understanding or investigating certain things. So anthropology has four fields: archaeology, physical or biological anthropology, cultural or social anthropology, and linguistics. And then within those four main fields, which deal with aspect of being human from very early on to today, we have what we called applied anthropology. And that is anthropology that combines more than one of these fields in order for us to investigate what we need to investigate and focus on a specific aspect of this specialty. And that's where forensic anthropology comes about, because it is a combination of forensic physical anthropology and forensic archaeology. Now, I also wanted to mention that in some countries, archaeology and anthropology are separate because archaeology is seen as more of a classical civilization, big buildings, architecture kind of work, while in anthropology, we're dealing more with the being human and the everyday lives of humans. So forensic anthropology is a set of methods about identifying the remains that come from physical anthropology, but yet archaeology is actually the methodologies that we use when we excavate, when we actually do recovery. And in the case of forensic anthropology, we use the medical legal setting. So it is not just identifying the bones, it is not just, recovering the remains, but actually doing it so it can be admissible in a court of law. So in this lecture, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use archaeological examples and for me to illustrate how much we can learn from people of the past, from humans of the past, and the importance of archaeological human remains, the processes of recoveries, what can we learn about trauma, pathology, culture, and biology, and how all of those things come into the way that we interpret what we actually see. And finally, I'm going to end with non-human examples and why it's important and how those connect with the cultural understanding of what we're seeing. Not quite a forensic scene, but I'm sharing this picture with everyone. As you might know, I live in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm a professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And nearby, the university is having excavations for a crime scene that actually was due to an environmental factor. And that was a volcanic eruption that covered Nebraska many millions of years ago. And at that point, we were not cold. We were actually a savanna environment. And what you see on the picture is the excavation indicating the modern layers. And then as we're going back through time to the actual skeletal remains of all the animals that had a catastrophic event that actually killed thousands of animals in one instant. So, why forensic archaeology? And it is critically important for us to understand what caused what we're seeing, what is the process of events, what is the and the order of what happened first, what follows after, along with the causation. And for us to also maintain very detailed records, because the archaeologist or the investigator are often the first people at whatever scene it is that we're asked to investigate. And that scene will never be the same after we finish our work. So it is hugely critical for us to be able to record in the best of our abilities so that the information can be preserved, the integrity, both in space and time, can also be maintained for us to be able to not only submit that evidence, but actually come to the most accurate interpretation. The kinds of sites that forensic archaeology deals with would be surface scatters, remains right on the surface that have not been covered up, burial sites that are deliberately buried people, but also mass disasters, and then more organized, larger scale sites such as cemeteries. So, as you know very well with your specialty, our bodies have lots of bones and microbes and cells, and we all have the same trajectory of birth, living, and death. And at this segment of my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about culture and how different cultures deal with the element of death. Whether people are being interred in the ground, the positioning of the body, if they're mummified, if they have an aerial burial, if they're cremated. Those are cultural components of body treatment. And a lot of people nowadays have Christian burials. Those assume a certain directionality, looking to the east, but other cultures, other religions are pointing to key elements of their culture and their tradition, whether it is looking towards Mecca or towards the land of Israel, or in the case of Anglican tradition, for the high-standing individuals to be looking to the west instead of east, so that they make sure that their followers, their flock, is protected. So with that introduction to some of the cultural components about burials, I wanted to bring up my first example, and that was an excavation that I participated in Red Hook Naval Cemetery, which is located in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is a suburb, is part of the tri-state area in New York. And the cemetery was associated with a naval hospital. And for a period of 80 years, more than 2,000 people were buried in the cemetery. Now, later in the 1920s, 1926, the hospital ceased to function at that particular locality, and the Navy ordered all the deceased, all the buried individuals, to be moved to a new location at the Cypress Hill Cemetery. Now, when I was involved in that in the 1990s, we were called back in because the Navy wanted to turn that part of Red Hook into a park, a public park. And we were asked to make sure that all the remains were actually removed, and that this area was no longer a sacred ground, a cemetery. So part of what we did was we used ground penetrating radar to actually be able to see what we can see without excavation. But what we had was actually a bit of mixed results, in that we did quite a bit of work, and we were able to identify, as you can see, 987 shafts, meaning empty burial locations. And the only thing in those shafts when we did test excavations were an occasional phalange or metatarsal, metacarpal, but the individual in its majority had been moved. Having said that, when we were ending the excavation, a backhoe was going in because they were going to dig for a path. And all of a sudden, I see the backhoe cutting straight through a burial and the buried individual on the profile. So, of course, I stopped the backhoe and we had to reassess. And what ended up happening is that you cannot just trust one methodology or even two in our situations, or three. You actually need to do quite a bit more. And that is, every fancy tool comes with a set of handicaps that you need to be very aware about. And in this particular situation, the ground penetrating radar was not picking up the coffins that were either had a large percentage of metal or were of a particular construction. So even though it was picking up greatly everything that was wood or everything that was a hollow shaft, it actually failed to read certain kinds of coffins. So the excavation did unearth a number of sets of remains that were relocated to Cypress Hill, but with modern methodologies and without being able to dig the entirety of the park area, we do understand looking at the hospital records, that we might be missing more than 1,000 individuals. So we have a park, but it is also still a sacred ground. Now, another place where I was asked to do work, and in some cases, some of my pictures are, I will not show you human remains. The other thing about culture, some cultures do not allow the capturing of images of the dead. So as anthropologists, we need to be very respectful on the cultural background of what it is that we're looking at. And we have to respect the people and cultural traditions. So in some cases, we're not able to, we're limited in the kind of study that we can do, and also prohibited from providing the actual visual images of the skeleton. Now, in this next example that I'm going to share with you, that was an investigation in New Jersey, and Dr. Joan Geismar was the archaeologist in charge, and I received a phone call and she said, Sophia, we're having a problem. So it was in a very public area. It was on the side of a highway and rail tracks, and the backhoe was digging asphalt to put a shelter for people to wait for the train and not be out in the rain. As the backhoe was going in, all these human remains were starting to come onto the surface. I rushed to the site, but thankfully the interpretation was, the first part of the interpretation was very easy. I saw on the soil profile, the outline, a very faint brown outline, and then in certain spots, the elements of rust. That was a coffin with nails. So one of the biggest concerns was whether they were disturbing a Native American site. But actually, with the presence of coffins, we know that is not the cultural tradition of the native peoples. And it was indicating more of a Christian tradition. Long story short, the bones were taken to the American Museum of Natural History, and they were identified as early Swedish origin peoples. And when Joan Geismar went to the local church, indeed, she found out that there were cemeteries and cemetery areas that did not make it into the records of the church, and that was one of the missing cemeteries. The time period that I'm referring to is late 1700s, early 1800s. Now, very respectfully, the New Jersey Transit said, okay, we're not going to disturb the location. The whatever, all the unearthed individuals were reburied, and they moved down and they start digging again. And then I get another phone call. But this time they were like, well, we know it's not Native American, but it's very strange because we have coffins, but the people were buried in a different direction. Sure enough, we connected with the Anglican Church, and that was a cemetery belonging to the Anglican Church in that part of New Jersey. So in this situation, culture matters, how you bury the dead, the orientation, because we were able to make interpretations about what we're seeing that led us to be able to find the correct descendants connections for these peoples. After both those excavations, the New Jersey Transit gave up their project, so they preferred people to stay in the rain rather than disturb the cemetery areas in an additional way. And another case, it was a very hot July where I got a phone call from downtown Manhattan in a street called Christopher Street, which is part of the village area in lower Manhattan. And as you know, New York City is a metropolitan center, a very big urban city, megalopolis, where a lot of, you see very little green except if you're in the park, and a lot of buildings of various sizes and roads and so on and so forth. So somebody might assume that New York City's archaeology has been all but gone. However, that couldn't be the furthest from what actually we know and we have been finding out. And in this particular situation, a church had given part of their properties up for sale. And the property for sale was the house that was being used for the priest to stay in. So this young family bought this house. In what was their backyard, there was a small cemetery, but everybody, and with crypts, with vaults, and everybody was supposedly to have been removed, except when they start doing construction in their new home and what would have been their new living room, they actually came up into one of those vaults. And I was called in to find out what we were seeing and if there was something in the vault. So I actually did have to go 6 feet under, and the vault was full. It actually had 7 individuals. And I was able to see that the individuals were not all buried at the same time, but in sequence. And that was done, how did I see? The dead were buried in platforms, but also you could see that there was a seriation in how the bodies were placed. It was 1 male, it was 3 females, and then the rest were children. But I also found remains from a meal, and that did not look like a ceremonial meal. It looked like somebody, the crypt was open, the vault was open, and maybe workers were having their lunch and tossed a couple of bones inside. And an unfortunate cat at some point was trapped in the vault. So she actually ended up passing. The other thing that I was able to see is that there have been flooding events, that I could see the watermarks on the vault area. So we had an excavation and we recovered the dead. And one of the questions was, who were they? And with looking at some of the clothing remains, because they were not fully decomposed, looking at the skeletal structure and records of the church and records from the township, we were able to decipher that one of the individuals was actually a barrister because he had a black robe on. And he was not from New York, but actually from Virginia. And he died in Lower Manhattan during an influenza, a flu outbreak, along with some of the children and one of the women. So again, the element of surprise, the element of culture, and also the unpredictability of where human remains can pop up. I think one of the biggest surprises about the cultural makeup of New York came out of the African burial ground, where a completely unknown area that basically we unearthed 400 individuals, primarily of African descent. So a big urban city with thinking that we have all the solutions, that we know everything about its past, yet again, is full of surprises, and it will continue to surprise. Much earlier in time, I was a student in the Jarigoli site in Kenya. The site of Jarigoli, the biggest question was what was happening. We did have human remains in what's called bundle burials, which is they would be placed in a earthenware and carried to a site. And we had these pillars marking the site. Now that site goes back into the Holocene. And we had a lot of grave goods coming up and beads. And one of the questions was what was happening at Jarigoli why do we only have parts of skeletons and not the complete skeletons? And long story short, that went into hunters and gatherers of the time and them moving around the landscape. So what happened here was that because they had to move over a landscape, they couldn't carry an entire deceased individual, but they would take a portion of the skeleton, bundle it up, and that would be what they would carry to the sacred ground. Now, while at Jarigoli, there was rumors that we might have had burials of a different kind in a nearby location. I was not part of this excavation, but actually what ended up in 2012 was one of the most interesting cases for the prehistoric past. That was the excavation of 27 individuals that were part of a massacre. There were 21 of them were adults, but there were children. There was a pregnant woman because we could see the fetal remains. People were bound, they were clubbed. You can see in the skulls, the blunt force trauma here and here. And then knees were, the knees of the individuals were clubbed and shattered. Over here, you can see the neck and skull and how that has been shattered. And in the last picture here, and also in the hands, the positionality of the remains indicating that people were bound. The next case that I'm going to talk about comes from Serbia. And this particular set of sites was excavated in the 1960s in a joint venture between Brooklyn College and the Smithsonian Institution. And the remains I actually found in the basements of Brooklyn College. Then I actually traced the information and who was involved, and I collected remains of from many different other institutions that were supposed to have studied them during the course of 40 or so years. And finally ending up my investigation in a retired colleague's garage to actually find the paperwork. The site became the doctoral dissertation of one of my students, and we were able to recover 550 individuals from that excavation in the 1960s. And so one of the questions for Sirmium, because the time period that is represented in the material that we looked at was from the Roman time period, roughly around 400 AD, all the way to the 1200s. And one of the questions was, what was the origin of the bed of the dead? Were they Roman? Were they local Serbian? Were some of the Turkish peoples that were moving to the area? Who were they? And so this collection was an incredible narrative about trauma, pathology, and culture. So I have selected just a handful of bones that show tidbits, examples of some of the things that we were able to see. And they're hugely important because it is actually rather rare for us to find these kinds of examples in some of the modern cases. And it's important for us to study them and know what it is that we're looking at and use this as information in cases that we might have to look at. So this very first slide, it is actually a trephination. If you can look at my pointer, this is a plug taken out of a skull right here. And trephinations were done for two different reasons. One is if somebody were to be hit on the head, the brain swelling would cause brain damage. So by opening the skull cavity, you were able to release that pressure, and then the person had a chance to not die from that trauma. Another case was, it was practiced as a way to release bad spirits out of the particular individual. What is interesting in this particular skull is that the trephination was not the cause of death. because we can see growth on the bone that is actually happened post-procedure. Another interesting aspect of studying these populations is health, disease, nutrition. So in this particular eye orbit, a lot of ancient populations did not have access to a balanced diet, so they had chronic iron deficiencies that exhibited themselves in anemia. And you can see the porosity in this eye orbit, which basically is the orbital roof exhibits cribra orbitalia, one of the classic signs for anemia. Now, this case here, this is a parietal bone, and we do not have an answer. We do not know whether this particular individual had a particular trait and the parietal bone was abnormally thick, or whether it had an infection or a disease that actually caused this abnormality. But again, that is something that we note, we investigate, and then we keep on looking at as new methodologies and new technologies become available for us to be able to come with our interpretation. Another interesting aspect, and that's also in honor of all my wonderful doctors that are dentists in Gujarat, is the dental pathologies. And we had pretty much every single tooth in that collection, and there were many, had an interesting pathology. So whether it was cavities and caries, or extreme wear from coarse food, abscesses and infections, or extreme calculus, it was a very interesting collection to actually look at dental health and problems relating from dental health. In one of the cases, it was the cause of death because it was in the upper dentition, and it was a ruptured abscess that went into the sinus cavity into the brain. Other things like in this clavicle, it's the sternal view. We actually have, due to damage in the soft tissue, we actually have the ligaments inserting themselves into the bone in a condition that's called enthesopathy. And we did have quite a few of those examples in the particular collection. One of the very interesting finds, especially when we're looking into the Roman time period, were ulna. We had a very large samples of ulna that were exhibiting amputation, fractures, infections, and all of them in a similar positionality. And those are actually defensive wounds. When somebody is attacking you, especially if you think Roman time period, you're thinking about swords or other objects that are going towards a person. What do? You raise your arm to protect your face, and then the ulna gets the brunt of the blow. A very large percentage of these defensive wounds. A very interesting study about how the body deals in aspects of warfare. Another important part of the cultural tradition in the time was crucifixion. This is a distal tibia exhibiting a crucifixion event. And that was very interesting because unlike the iconic images of what is a crucifixion, the penetration is normally never in the soft tissues in between the metatarsal or metacarpals, or in the phalanges, because the body of the weight will actually shred the point, and the person would not be able to be crucified. So crucifixion actually would take place in sturdier bones that were able to support the weight of the body. And in this collection, we actually had some evidence. Other things were, while we saw the very specialized trephination, we also saw a lot of individuals that had fractures that were never aligned. So what you see here is a tibia with a fracture that was never set, therefore making that leg of the individual about 5 to 6 centimeters shorter than the non-broken leg. And on the side here, I have a cross section of a healing fracture, and you can see the various stages of infection and how those were calcified prior to the final stabilization of the area. Other things that we saw in this population was a lot of bone deterioration due to arthritis, due to possibly pathologies induced to specific labor. And in this particular situation, we have a part of the spinal cord with osteophytosis and osteophytes growing, this bone growth where I have the arrows, which would have made the back of this person extremely painful. That comes from lifting a lot of weights and a lot of wear and tear. And so from Sirmium and these cases, for one, the cases that I was able to share point to probably a local population and not the Roman army. There were all kinds of ages, quite a few adults, but the kinds of wounds that were defensive, but also the diet and what we can see in the rest of the skeleton point to rather poor nutrition, a lot of hard labor, and the age range would not fit what we would say would have been a Roman soldier. So for that portion of the cemetery that we got to look at, and also because we had gender diversity, we would probably point to more of a local population rather than a selection of the soldiers. Now, the last part of my presentation is from my my study area in Barbuda. Barbuda is the sister island of Antigua, so of the nation Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean. And when I was called to work in Barbuda, it was because the site of Seaview, which you can see in this area here, was actually disturbed because of sea level rise. And then another site was actually, which is near Seaview Indian Town Trail, was disturbed because of quarrying activities. And what happens, and it has been happening every year for the last 15 years that I've been working in Barbuda, when you have a storm, the dune that you can see on your screen here keeps on getting eroded as the vegetation dies. And through that erosion, what's hidden in the dune is actually comes to the surface. And we did have organized excavations from 2008 through 2012 in the dune, but we didn't want to destabilize the dune any further. So we stopped after we had a clear understanding of what was happening. And what is happening is a series of burials in the seaside of this site, dating from 450 to 650 AD. And behind the dune, we were able to find out that the site did not end, but it actually continued, and we even had earlier phases. Now, what you see here, my colleague pointing at, is actually the knees of an individual that is in a fetal position buried into the dune system. And you can see here, this is shortly after we discovered this episode of human remains coming up. We had a total of 4 individuals. The ones that were still more in place, as you can see in the middle here, the face was towards the ocean and the body was in a fetal position with the arms around the legs. And in this particular individual that is here, we actually had some big pottery vessels that were placed in near the person's belly area. That is after field recovery. You can see that the skull is slightly modified. And the preservation, which is one of the interests of mine, is the taphonomical agents and how those act on bone. You can see that there has been, all the articular ends have been destroyed because of the sand matrix that these bones were at. Another interesting aspect from the material in Barbuda is that so far we have about 6 human skeletons, and 2 of them actually were surrounded. Each one of them had 1, 2, and 1 in terms of pattern dogs. And we had the burial of dogs surrounding the individual, and that's important to know. And that's one of the great things that you get by having an organized excavation, because it is not a random dog walking around. It is actually, these dogs were bound. The way that their feet were similar to the previous pictures from Kenya of other bound individuals. And we suspect from the way that the head was positioned and the body that they might have been alive when they were buried. So that is not an accidental death of a dog that happened to be near the excavation, but rather the premeditated burial of dogs near individuals. We actually have investigated this further, and there are 26 burials of this kind that come out of Puerto Rico, and many more that have come out of the French Caribbean to what now is known as a cultural practice. And of course, you know, when you have a cultural practice, you don't really have any manuals or any information about why and what did it mean. So we can only postulate that dogs have an important role in people's lives. They protect. If you're a hunter, they help you get food. And also they can always find their way home. So in a burial situation, we might postulate that they help the dead find their way to the afterlife, and that they were also guarding them from whatever harm might come their way. So their purpose in life being translated and go into a similar function at the time of death. And this is the very last example that I'm going to share with all of you, and that is when we have surprises. You can see in the middle here, I'm looking out of this cave, and on the left of your screen is actually the footprint of the cave. All the dotted lines indicate very low ceiling where you have to crawl under. And we started these excavations because we had noted what we thought might have been human remains, but actually was a single bone. So if there was a burial, it was no longer a burial. And what we were able to find as we crawl under the chambers and moved all the way to the back of this cave, this little niche here that I'm pointing with my arrow is actually represented on the far left of your picture. And that was a niche in the far chamber in where we had to crawl on our bellies to find. And in that tiny niche, we actually uncovered a multitude of faunal remains. And these faunal remains were not the result of food, but it was the result of probably a ritual. Because what we found was 76 bones belonging to cats, but not a single cat. But by doing MNI, it was actually 11 or more cats. And in the schematic representation of the skeleton, what you see darker is the most elements. So you can see here the jaw, the humerus, the ulna. So we had limbs from cats, we had jaws from cats, and we had atypical breaks that do not happen out in nature. So if an animal breaks its leg is not a spiral fracture. So in this situation, our investigation was not about finding out what happened to a human, but in trying to understand this very atypical context. Other than the 76 cat bones, we had a 3-month-old complete deer skeleton coming out, a parrotfish vertebra, a smoking pipe, 2 glass goblets, and a sheep's toe that was drilled through, and a rib from a cow that had a punctated design. Now, people often make fun of archaeologists that whatever we cannot explain, we actually call ritual. But in this particular situation, we do think that this is a ritualistic deposit. And part of its patterning, it is very similar to what would have been an obeah ritual. And obeah rituals take place, they are for protection. And normally you represent them with various bones from animals in a landscape, and a carnivore like a cat, but also with the symbolism of what you're protecting yourself from. The clay pipe, the smoking pipe that we found, was actually from the early 1800s. There was also lead backshots from a gun, and the goblets had the British Navy insignia on them. 1834 marks emancipation for the island of Barbuda. So one can only postulate that the ritual might have been related to the emancipation from Britain. So to end my presentation, I shared with you a number of examples with trauma, pathology, culture, and how understanding the sequence of events, doing equal amounts of research and investigation to find information, and being very detailed in how we describe things, we can get insights that are critical for us to be able to explain what we see in time, place, environment, and possible cultural affiliations. And our job as forensic archaeologists is to approach this, to approach every case that we have with the same amount of enthusiasm, detail, and dedication, so that we can always provide the best context for the analysis, so that we can come up to the most accurate of interpretations. And in that, I would like to thank you for inviting me and open the floor for the questions that you might have for the things that I was able to share with you today.
Thank you, Sophia, for taking out the session, and this really interesting session. We have few questions from the participant. So I'm taking one by one question. There is a one question from the Kratika Mishra. And the question is, do crucifixion still occur as a punishment?
Do crucifixion still happens as punishment? Is that the question?
Yes.
In some places, but it's not as widespread as it was in the earlier times. But yeah, it still can happen.
Okay. Another question I have from the Shivam Mani Tripathi. If I found a single bone that is a femur on scene of crime, how can we determine that it is a male or female femur?
If you find a femur, whether you know whether it's a male or female?
Yes.
A lot of that will be primarily on your metrics and what you know about your local population. You can also do DNA work.
Another question, what is the role of archaeologists in the presence of forensic expert?
Please repeat that for me.
What is the role of archaeologists in the presence of forensic experts?
Archaeology, the practices of archaeology is what actually is used for the recovery of remains. So even in a modern case, you use the principles and practices of archaeology to be able to do your recovery.
Yeah, Ellen, Anil, he has some questions, so you can ask your query.
Alan, Anil, do we need to unmute?
Yeah, he can unmute. Anil, can you unmute yourself? Abhishek, Bhomik, you want to ask a question, so you can unmute yourself.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, audible. Please, Abhishek.
Good evening, Sophie. I would like to ask a question. Are you listening to me?
Your voice is very low, so can you be a bit louder, closer to the mic? I think your voice is very low. So,
Hello, hello. Am I audible right now?
yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, what I would like to ask is that from the human skeletal remains, we have got evidences of various paleopathologies like syphilis or leprosy or tuberculosis, and even disorders like osteoarthritis and osteomyelitis. So, what evidences you have found apart from this for the paleo pathological cases apart from the ones that I have mentioned?
We have not really found, we have found tuberculosis. So the viral infection had created lesions and porosities in the chest cavity, and we did have one case that I believe was syphilis, but that's the only one that we had out of that particular cemetery in Serbia.
Another question we have, how do you discern a postmortem injury from a perimortem injury?
Yeah, part of it has to do with whether something is a fresh cut, break, or flake versus something that was, done before. We also look in the case of injuries whether there has been any form of healing. So it all has to do with when the injury occurred. And whether there is healing and whether something is it's fresh. In some of the bones, you might have seen some modern flaking that has happened. So it was a difference in color, texture, and presence. And when in doubt, we would look under microscopy versus something that was happened earlier on. In the case of crucifixion, you had both. You had the actual drilling that happened um, in the ancient environment, but then you had subsequent damage of the bone on the external surface because the surface of the bone was actually fragile. So there was some subsequent flaking, but that was modern and post-modern.
I have another question from the YouTube live. Mohammad Hadid wants to ask how you determine the age of a mummified or half decomposed body if you haven't radiological material.
How do you determine the age if you don't have carbon-14 dates?
Yes.
It depends on where these bodies are found. If they're found in a soil context, in a soil horizon, we are able to date other things within that. In some of the early excavations in Kenya, for instance, one of the indicators we would use would be in the horizon, in the soil horizon, if you have different kinds of pig remains, because pigs evolved and they changed their dentition and size of their heads through time. And we have this time scale. So depending on what species and what would be the characteristics, we would actually be able to narrow it down to a particular time period. So anything that would be found within that context, we would have an idea approximately when. When I was working in Iceland, we knew the dates of particular volcanic eruptions, and each particular tephra has a different date, and they're identified by different color, by different texture. So when you had the layers of soil and then they were sealed with these tephra phenomenons, then knowing the tephra age, we were able to decipher the time period represented in the remains that we were looking at. So there are different ways. Of course, another thing that you can use sometimes is whatever, if there are artifacts, if there are objects, within the deceased individual that also might give you an idea about a possible time period. But of course, the most direct would be to do a carbon-14 dating of the actual bone. But we have all these other indicators that can really help us narrow down the time period that we're looking at.
We have Ruchika Trivedi. She wants to ask some question. Ruchika, you can unmute and ask your query. Priya, you can unmute and ask your query.
Hello. Hello.
I ask.
Yes, I want to ask a question.
Okay, please, Alex.
Okay. I'm joining from Nigeria, Africa.
Okay.
So, yeah, my question is this. In this anthropology forensic, now these oil duplications of our environment, can someone take the sample of this crude oil to know the number of years these people has been exploiting it, or the kind of things that has happened? Because there are some agreement that was signed, but people could not be able to know. But if we can be able to have a substance, a soil where those people are buried, or what, can we be able to identify what actually killed the people after 50 years? Hello, did you get my question?
I'm not sure that I understood your question. Can you repeat it for me?
Okay. Now there was a death that occurred 56 years ago.
Yes.
56 years ago. And
Felix, I think your connection is bandwidth is low. So can you type your question in the chat box? I will read from the chat box.
so the place they were murdered according to pointing. So can we be able to have a to know how?
Another question we have from the Hadi. Did your work ever help solving recent homicidal cases?
No, I do not do modern homicides. I work with my colleagues that do, but I prefer my cases to be older than that.
Okay. So I think we have covered the maximum question. Few questions are still left. And Felix, if you can type your question because your voice is breaking a lot. So if you can just type your question, I will read from chat box. Another question we have, can you please elaborate how you would start processing a scene with multiple remains?
Yeah, I mean, you actually have to start from what occurs first. So you need to look at the stratigraphy of remains and the relationship to one another. So whether you have, for instance, there was a case in Florida where a pit was dug and 3 people were put in the pit when and murdered. And then the archaeologists had to go and excavate that particular case to find out what happened. So the individuals were bound, and what the archaeologist was able to decipher is, first, the pit was dug, then the people were placed bound in the pit, then they were shot in place at the pit. So, finding the shell casings and the wounds and the positionality of the bodies. So that was the sequence of events that actually transpired. So they were not killed before, but they were killed in place. So you really need to look at your evidence, the positioning of the bodies, and also the surrounding areas to be able to see what other elements might be connecting to your case. In this particular situation, a big enough area had to be opened so that the shell casings would be part of the description of the crime scene. And all of that, of course, was covered, and a full-on excavation had to take place. So it is case by case, and you have to set up your scene. You have to first record it before you touch anything, because forensic archaeology and forensics in general is in itself a destructive process, because the investigator that goes to a site, that area will never be the same ever again, because things have to be recovered from it. So you really need to spend time recording to the maximum everything that you see in place before anything gets altered, because you probably will be the last individual and the only individual that will see the scene untouched. And as we know, both modern crime scenes but also archaeological sites deteriorate and change very fast, and that can affect people's interpretation.
Another last question I'm going to take. Felix is asking, can we use the soil to know the cause of death after 56 years?
No, it's too soon, it's too early. You would have to find something different. You can use that in paleo situations, but not in modern times, because you do not have, with domestication, you actually do not have the same markers that you would have had then.
And the last question from the Hadi, how does your work help understand cultures and the change old wrong ideas about different cultures?
That's a very interesting question. I guess part of it is just learning about a culture, and in some situations is understanding better. One of the things that quite often we hear is how bad humans are for the environment, how we always make the wrong decisions. And the work that we did in Iceland, it actually proved exactly the opposite. In the Viking Age, we actually had people thinking about the environment, thinking about their grazing strategies, their fishing strategies, and using the environment in an appropriate way. And there is still a living example of these very thoughtful processes alive today. And that is in the Lake Mývatn, which is in the northeastern part of Iceland. We have sustainable duck egg harvesting for over 1,000 years, and it still happens today, and the species is still present. It is one of the richest places in the world in terms of duck migration, and none of the ducks are being eradicated. It would have been very easy to eat the ducks, but actually people have a harvesting strategy where they take only 3 out of the 5 eggs, so the ducks lay more eggs. And actually the ducks that provide the eider down for making coats or comforters or what have you, the farmers protect the ducks, and actually anyone wandering by can be in real trouble if they're disturbing those ducks. So that is actually something that archaeologically we found 1,000 years ago at the very first settlement of Iceland by the Viking peoples. So it is not always people wanting to kill and destroy and affect everything that we touch, but actually we have beautiful scenarios where people have been trying to do sustainable practices, and we wouldn't have known about it if archaeology was not there to show us how they were trying to do that and how successful they were for a course of 1,000 years.
So here we have reached to the end, and thank you so much for taking out a wonderful session. I request you to accept the certificate of appreciation from Sherlock Institute of Forensic Science for delivering a wonderful session. Although we are in the virtual space, so kindly accept this certificate of appreciation for delivering your wonderful talk, and all the participants has been benefited by your talk. Here, I would like to thank my team also for their dedication to reaching out different platform, so that more and more people can be benefited by the different aspects and different knowledge of the forensic sciences. There's my team member. They are working day and night to reach a different part of the world and different people. And usually we completed in the pandemic, we have completed 2.5 lakh participants in our events. And with the unique registration, 42,000 individuals, and many of them are the repeated. So these are my team members. We have a team member not only from the India, but from the other country also, from Philippines, from Thailand, from Moga is there, from Botswana. So from other country, we have our team members, those who are working and reaching to the people. Thank you, my team member. I request you all to accept the certificate of appreciation from Institute for your hard work you are doing day and night to reaching more and more people. Aditi Maurya, Afreen, Amala, Amber, Anjali, Anmol, Aarti, Aarti Vashne, Dr. Janita, Dr. Pooja Chakravarthy, my co-host. She reached to you for arranging this wonderful talk. Falak, GV Sai Soumya, Isha, Zevel, Kanheri, Kratika, Lakshya, Lashika, Narbal, Moga, Neha Sharma, Nimisha, Pallavi, Poonam, Prerna, Priya, Raj, Roshan, Ruchika, Sarang, Sheetal, Sheza, Shivani, Suchi, Svetan, Tania Jaiswal, and the last Vaishnavi. We have decided our team member to represent the certificate of appreciation in the alphabetical order so that no hierarchy should be maintained and they all feel equal being a team member of Sherlock Institute of Forensic Science. With this, I welcome you all on our second, here you can find that how you can download the certificate. So here is the link of the website, forensicevents.com/download certificate. You all can download the certificate. Here you have to put your registered email ID and then you can download your certificate. And I welcome you again on the next international lecture series that is on the 14th October. And this is going to be very interesting because the title itself is a very interesting and it's called that the power of a picture, identifying people through the images of their hands. What are their hands, their different lines and other things, how these works and how you can find that useful in the forensic identification. So the lecture will be taken by the same the honor of SST Forensic and renowned forensic expert. I will welcome you again all on 14th with my moderator, Rashika Vaishnav on 14th. I would once again thank you, Sophia, for taking out the time. And I request my co-host, Dr. Pooja Chakravarthy, to give a vote of thanks. Dr. Pooja, over to you.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sparing your valuable time with us. I know it's very early morning over there, but in spite of that, you agreed to be with us, and that's actually a we are thankful to you for that, ma'am. And a special thank goes to all our participants who made sure to be with us, and they were actively participating in all the events we had organized so far. We wish to have your support all throughout, and see you with the next lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pooja. Thank you, Sophia, for taking a lecture. I would like to concluding remarks from your side before ending the session.
I just, you were all amazing. I'm very impressed with what you have been organizing, the kind of knowledge that you're sharing with all your interested participants. I enjoy your dedication, the dedication of your audience, and the incredible things and strides that you're taking towards forensic investigation. And I'm really very proud and privileged to have been invited to participate in this quest for knowledge. So I wanted to thank you and to congratulate you for all the incredible things that you do. And I'm especially grateful for Dr. Pooja because she's one of the first people that I met when I first visited Gujarat. And she has been a remarkable person, a colleague, and a scholar that I really treasure and I appreciate. So thank you very much to your audience, to you, to your organization committee, and to the wonderful things that I do. And I'm available to any and all if I can be of any help in any of your pursuits. Thank you.